Hello, in this video we are going to talk about the importance of indentation and spacing. Let's get to it. One of my biggest pet peeve is that if there are developers that I'm working with, they don't know how to utilize spacing and indentation. And it's really hard to manage your code that way just because of how things look. And also, it's really bad practice for you to have that. But when I'm talking about having indentation and spacing, essentially is a convention of how you would write code. Is one of the reasons what you would do and how you would write your code at a certain way. And this really boils down to developing good habits really early on when you start to begin to code. But if you already develop a bad habit of not utilizing spacing or indentation, now would be a really good time to go ahead and change that habit into a good one. And there are a few reasons of why we should use indentation and spacing. And the one and most important thing is that when you are coding, you're not coding for yourself, you're actually coding for other people. And in most cases, when you are working within a project or when you are working within a group, you are most likely going to be sharing your code. And if you have different kind of spacing and indentation than other people, then it might be a little bit hard to collaborate and also to distribute your code just because of how the way it looks. And we basically live in an open source community when it comes to coding. That means that everything that you do is available to the public. So not only are you able to see it, but other people are able to see it as well. And that also opens up into collaboration. It is the best thing you would use when you're working in a coding environment. It really helps organize your code because it helps you distinguish between what is what, and also it can have segregations within your code so you can know which section is which, and it also keeps your code all nice and neat. Because that is something that all developers, no matter who you are or what you're developing, you will always encounter errors. If you have proper spacing and indentations, they're easier to track down if you do have errors. But if you have improper spacing and indentation or bad habits of doing spacing and indentation, it will be pretty hard to track down where exactly that error is. Because in most cases, when you do have an error, it will tell you which line number and also around which method it is around. But if you don't have the right spacing or indentation, it will probably point you into the wrong direction. And then the last reason of why we need to utilize indentation and spacing is that in some languages, proper spacing and also indentation might mean something else. And what I mean by that is that in Python, if you want to start a new line or a new method or anything like that, you need to do a proper indentation as well as a new line break. If you put everything all in one line, then you'll probably get a syntax error. You're probably getting an error within the language itself. And in some languages, spacing and indentation is actually needed within the language. It actually serves a purpose within the programming language itself. So let me actually give you some best practices and some tips and tricks of how you can develop a good habit of spacing and indentation. So when you are doing indentation, I would recommend doing 2 to 4. And that is what the recommended is either 2 or 4. But I see most people actually use a 2-tab indentation. And if you don't know what kind of tab indentation you have, I'll show you where it is or around which area within your text editor that will say that. And when you are creating elements, it is best practice for you to embed all your elements inside of an indentation. So if there's a parent or child, or if there's some sort of a grouping element, you need to indent it so you know that that part of the code is inside of the other parent. And when you are utilizing spacing, that really helps with reading your code. If everything has no spaces, then words are harder to read. Imagine if I have this whole presentation without any spaces. It will be really hard to distinguish what is what. And coding is the same way. You need to also utilize your spaces. That way we know what is what and we are very clear of what we're actually doing. And when you are utilizing spacing and indentation, you should be consistent. You shouldn't have some indentation here or there and some spacing here or there. You should always have proper indentation and spacing, whether it's 2-tab or 4-tab. Just keep consistent throughout all your projects. Always do 2 tabs in all your projects, things like that. So always be very consistent when it comes to things like the spacing and indentation. And then I would strongly recommend you have every single element inside of a new line. And this might not be necessary for every single case, but in most cases it really does work. When you have stuff inside of your coding program, you need to have it organized in a way where you need to separate things together, or else everything will all blend together and might look weird, things like that. So utilizing your enter, your space, and your tab really helps bring out your code and makes it the best code that it could be. Now, let me show you where are the proper buttons, and it's okay if you don't know where it is. Let me show you where they are. So here is the spacebar. That's probably the most common one that you'll be using, is this spacebar, and those are really good for making spaces. And I'll show you where the spaces are. We'll go into a couple examples after this. And here, this is where the tab is. So when you have a tab, that is very different than a space. Tabs and space, they're actually two different inputs. So when you are tabbing or spacing, you should make sure you know which one you're using out of each of them. Because technically, they both kind of look the same, but in actuality, if you actually look at it at an input point, they are two different things. So a tab is more like an indentation, and a space is just a single space. And then here is the return or enter key. That is where you need to do a new line. And there are cases where you would need to do a new line, not everything in a single line. So now let's go ahead and talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to spacing and indentation. So let's go first with the bad. This is what it looks like when you have no indentation. You have every single thing inside of your program here all in one line. And to be honest, this technically does work. Like, it does run with no errors. If there aren't any errors within the code, like, it still works, but then it's really hard to work with. Like, if I want to change something in the footer, I have to scroll all the way to find the footer, right? And then make changes there. And that might be harder for other people. If they're working on something on the same exact page, they need to scroll back and forth between the individual parts of the code itself. And that might cause conflicts, especially on GitHub, because you're all changing a single line of code. And also, if you get errors, especially if you have errors that are syntax based, those usually point you in the right direction, especially with the line number right here. In this particular case, if you have an error, it says that your error is on line 1. That's so useful, right? That is as useful as if you are asking for directions and someone said that the place that you're going is somewhere over there. So that is why we shouldn't use no indentation here, because it's really bad practice. Granted, it does work, but it's not really efficient as the way we want it. So now let's go into the ugly. So here's where most students, as well as most people that learn coding, this is where they start to develop their bad habits, is that they do utilize indentation and spacing, but not in a correct manner. And you can see here, we have a lot of things. If you show this to a senior or mid developer, they'll be very cringe when they look through this code. It's really hard to look at. And the reason being is that we have so much inconsistency. And some of the stuff may or may not work. Like, if you have spaces outside of here, that might not read it, especially in HTML, if that is a tag or not. And also, no spaces here, they might think that that's a whole entire element within HTML, so that might cause another error. And this is really tough to work with. If you're working with other people and they're working on different sections, like let's say the supporting section, they don't know where it starts and where it ends. So that's really bad to work with when you do have this type of indentation. And there are some elements that still kind of work, like 19 and 20 and all that, but overall this isn't a good way to write your code because of how it looks and also how you're writing it. This is really a cause for concerns when you do write your code like this, because it might not be as efficient as possible when you are writing your code like this. So again, don't be like this. Don't write your code like this. Make sure you use proper indentation and spacing. So now let's go into what you should be doing, which is the good. So here is the good way of how you should utilize your spacing and indentation. You can see here that every element and parent element and child element are all embedded inside of each other. For example, within this navbar, I have a div that is inside of another div and inside of another nav right here, and I can signify that with indentation, right? If I have that all in one line, it would be hard to distinguish of what is the parent element or what is the child element. But here you know that this is the outermost and then this is the innermost element within the nav bar. So that might be easier to distinguish when you are working within information. And the other thing is that we are using proper spacing. And what spacing, I'm not talking about spacing like this because that's what text. And of course you should have spacing in text. I'm talking about spacing like this. Just those little tiny details like so, and no spacing right here. That really helps with what you are writing your code, because that will cause less errors, and also it will look a lot more better and for you to distinguish where things are within your code. And you can also see that we also have certain elements where we just have line breaks. So line breaks is just what the return key, and usually, again, this really depends on your style and what your environment is that when you do have line breaks, those segregate each section. So this section here, that's the navbar, Jumbotron, supporting. Those are all distinguished by the grouping elements, as well as indentation, as well as line breaks. So you actually are able to spot it a lot more better. And here, on this type of style, if you do have an error, it will actually point you to the line number again. And here, it's actually a lot more straightforward of what the error is. So let's say if I'm missing like a ending tag right there, it will say that my code is broken somewhere around line 14. Well, on line 14, I can just look at this single line and see what's wrong. And that is a lot more better than what we have here, where it points you only in a generic spot, or here, where it may or may not be the right line, or the right section or element, right? So each element itself should have their own indentation as well as their own line. So this is what you should strive your code to look like, is proper spacing and indentation. And again, I'm using two-space indentation. You can see here, right here within the element. Let me see if I can scroll this up for you. Right there, that is the indentation, which is equivalent to two spaces. So technically, inside of VS Code, you could do two spaces, and that would be the same, but you can actually just do tab, and that would change it to whatever it is you need. But most cases, you would do two. And to change it, you can just press this in VS Code, and you can use spaces or use tabs. And then the other place you can use is inside of your top element. If you're on a Mac, you would go into your preferences and settings. And I just click on the code up there if you don't have seen that yet. And here, what I am going to do is it should be one of the options at the very top. If not, you can search it up. But it is going to be tab size here. So this is where you could change your tab size. I know by default, some of them may be like 4 or 6 or something, but be sure to change it to 2 or whatever it is that your environment is working in. And there are a lot of tools to help you with indentation. Especially in VS Code, there's a setting where you can turn on where you can see certain tabs of places of where spaces are defined. So if I do like this, you can kind of see that it's a little bit off. So I can just follow it just right at the line. Then I know that is the right place to have proper spacing and indentation. And other ones are packages within the text editor itself. So for example, here for extensions, there's also like Prettyfire or Prettier. They are all good things and tools to help you with indentation and to prettify your code. But again, sometimes there might be some configurations you need to do, or it might be part of the tool itself. So that might be something to look into, but to be honest, I've been developing for a while now, for a few years, and I used to use Prettyfire a lot, but to be honest, I don't think it's a good tool because it actually allows you to develop bad practice of always relying on the tool to help clean up your code. A better thing to do is to develop a good habit of always having good spacing and tabs, and that is a better thing to do than just utilizing a tool to do it for you. So I would be cautious when you are using these tools because it does give you a crutch and you shouldn't rely on them much when you are using those tools. If you want to know the settings for this, I believe it might be the spacing or indentation setting within your VS Code or text editor, and that might show you what it is within your text editor. So just to wrap up, the best thing for you to do and to develop a great habit is to utilize your spacing and indentation. And it is a really good thing to help you be more open source and to help other people contribute into your personal code. And it's also a good way to keep your code organized and also up and running as well as functional. And when errors do occur, you can also see where they are a lot more better if you don't have proper indentation or spacing. And lastly is that depending on the coding language, you would have to do proper spacing and indentation because it might signify something like a new method or a new start of a function, things like that. So some best practices that I would recommend is that you should always have 2 to 4 tab indentation. If not, then it might look a little bit wonky. But the 2 tab indentation is actually the most common used one, so I would actually change it to 2 if stated otherwise. And when you are creating elements, you should always have your parent element. In this case, let me show you. Parent element be the outermost, and then children elements will be the innermost, and that is followed by indentation. So you know where the parents are and where the child elements are at. And also utilize your spacing. Spacing is really good to help give some separation within your code, and it also helps it keep organized here and there within your program. And always be consistent. Don't have one thing be 4 tabs indentation and another one be 2. Be consistent throughout your whole entire program. And lastly is that make sure that you have each individual element on their own line. That way it also helps you be organized and also helps you have a much more readable code when you are developing it. And that is pretty much it for the importance of spacing and indentation. If you have any comments, post it down below and I will see you in the next video. See ya!